Thank you, companions, for being here today. Another issue of General Grand Council Presents. Today, we are going to hear about the importance of being Zebud from none other than the Deputy General Grand Master of Cryptic Masons International and a past most illustrious Grand Master from the great jurisdiction of Missouri, Bill Snyder.
Thank you, Steve. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. This is, of course, a day in which we expected very low attendance. We actually have pretty good attendance. So hopefully you can share anything of interest that I come up with. You can share it with some of the other companions, and perhaps they can look at the recorded version of it, or invite me to their state, and I will come and make the presentation in person. And as always, no presentation of mine is ever the same unless it is recorded. I always add something in different along the way when I can, so that you're constantly given something to think about. In this instance, the importance of being Zebud. There's a play on that from the importance of being earnest that some of you may know from perhaps a class that you took in high school or college. But nevertheless, there is kind of a double meaning to all this. You'll recall that within the Select Master degree, we have this fellow named Zebud, and he's described as a particular friend of King Solomon's. And so it becomes that many times when one hears about this in the degree and afterwards as either as a candidate who went through the Select Master degree, or as someone who is involved in the conferral of it, you just think, oh, well, this is just some special pal of King Solomon. This is, a guy that was his childhood friend and, hangs around the palace. He doesn't have much functionality within the government of King Solomon. He's just this ne'er-do-well who happens to stumble upon, with bad luck, an open door, and he stumbles into this place of danger, and he's about to be put to death. And along with that goes the what I call the comedy relief moment of almost all cryptic masonry, but also when it's done in the middle of a festival, either on that first day or at the beginning of a second day, when people watch the character of A-Haishar. And of course, the name, as you have people that try to study Hebrew, they'll say, oh, it's A-Haishar, or it's A-Haishar. There's different ways to pronounce it. The importance is, who A-Haishar is more important, and sometimes lost because of the comedy relief moment of him sleeping. And usually whoever's portraying A-Haishar over by the door, the inner door in most of our degrees in our rituals, he's over there snoring as loudly as he can, and the best ones, it gets louder and louder as it goes along. It starts off quietly and just kind of moves up in volume, so that when the time comes for someone to notice what A-Haishar has done and what his failure is of that moment, that when he's being awakened and he yells, "Mercy, mercy," most of the time we're all laughing. And I don't know if it's because we know the guy's really not being put to death, but we have to think about why that is funny. Why is that misfortune something that we react to that way? But it is there, and there's not a lot of explanation given for it. And it's because at the time in the degree, we're not telling you, but in the lecture, which has been around for quite a long time, in that lecture, there's more explanation given of who he is. So we picture A-Haishar as being, a sleepy guard at a door, and the door is open, or it comes open when Zebud approaches, and he either is stepping over A-Haishar or doesn't see A-Haishar, to wake him and say, hey, I need admittance. And we sometimes have, as we do in some of our jurisdictions, they've come up with a A-Haishar soliloquy. And when I first heard it, I thought, oh, well, that's kind of nice. But the problem is A-Haishar soliloquy is actually inappropriate because it's in conflict with both the ritualistic portrayal of A-Haishar and the history that is given as part of the lecture part of the degree. He is not someone who is ignorant of what is going on in the development of the 8 arches. He is not someone that would not have, he would be like, oh, mystified about what might be going on in the 9th arch, as is stated in A-Haishar soliloquy. And he's just very tired because he's overworked and he doesn't know what he's been working all these long hours for. So he doesn't feel appreciated. So he takes his little nap there at the door. The problem with that is he's described in the history as being one of the selective 27. You'll recall it says that the selective 27 were comprised of our 3 ancient Grand Masters, 22 men from Gabal, a city in Phoenicia, a fellow named Adoniram, who you've all heard of, and A-Haishar. And that those 24 plus the 3 ancient Grand Masters, but those 24, 22 men of Gabal, Adoniram and A-Haishar, are the ones who are constructing and have constructed the first 8 arches, 1 through 8. Hardly a person among them there would not be aware of what was going on and what the purpose was. It's not likely, is it? It says they're all highly skilled in the arts and sciences. So the portrayal of A-Haishar as being kind of a buffoon is incorrect. It's inconsistent with the intent of the degree. What we do know is that A-Haishar is the Grand Steward and that he is at a door. And you say, well, yeah, he's at the entrance to the 9th arch. And actually, he's not. He's at the door, on the inside of a door, it would appear, of a spatial entrance into the 9th arch from King Solomon's most retired room directly into the 9th arch. He didn't have to go through the other 8 arches, which were heavily guarded, as we later discover after Zebud's life is saved. So A-Haishar holds a very important position. And as Grand Steward, as in many of our jurisdictions, Grand Steward, like Missouri, is the Grand Master's appointee for the advancing line. And if it's not in an advancing line, it is one of the first or second offices to which election occurs. And so it's someone in which you should repose great trust. Biblically, A-Haishar is described as the head of the household. And you could interpret that as being Benson off the old TV show. He's the butler at a rich man's house, and the guy becomes governor or is governor, and then later discovers that, Benson gives great advice, and he makes Benson the what? Chief of staff of the governor's office in that TV show. Well, A-Haishar is, in fact, the more correct interpretation of the text there is not head of the household, it is chief of staff. And that is indeed where the White House parlance comes from, of having a chief of staff. And as chief of staff, you go through him if you want to see King Solomon, just as you would if you want to see the president. It goes through the chief of staff. It's a very important position. And in King Solomon's time, no doubt, it had equal importance. And he was given the very special job of knowing when King Solomon was coming and going from the 9th arch, and going from the 9th arch back to his chambers, his rooms within the palace. So that's why there's not 20 or 30 guards there, because the palace is heavily guarded on the other side, on the external part, leading up to King Solomon's bedroom. And then on this side, it's less guarded because it's a direct entrance, direct access to the ninth arch. And then, of course, the other entrance to the ninth arch through the first 8 is heavily guarded and requires your ability to show the proper signs. With regard to A-Haishar, I have in past talks contended that A-Haishar was in fact in his position, a trusted position within both the Select of 27, but also his governmental position as chief of staff, because he was a blood relative, most likely a blood relative of King Solomon. Now, his name can be translated as singer of songs. And that brings to mind Song of Solomon. But there are the greater authority is in favor of this translation, brother of a prince. Well, I think we've got there the answer that in fact A-Haishar is related to King Solomon. Probably in that context, brother of a prince rather than being a fellow prince. He's probably a nephew or a cousin of King Solomon, probably descended from the other children of Solomon who did not join with Adonijah in challenging Solomon for the right to rule Israel. And so he's one of the loyalists, one of the ones that remain true to Solomon and David's promise to Bathsheba that Solomon would be his successor, as we know from the Silver Trial or Thrice Illustrious Master. In the case of Zebud, his name is translated given, bestowed, presented, and I hesitate to say endowed. This, I think, means that he's gifted, has special talents that are useful in the government. He is described as the principal officer among King Solomon's governors of the 12 areas. And so he's not, it's interesting. There's an Azariah who's mentioned in the Bible in 1 Kings 4, who is over the officers, but then Zebud is mentioned as being the principal officer. And it suggested the correct, more correct translation of that would be prime minister. I think for the purposes of what we actually see in terms of the term particular friend, which is also used in some of the Canaanite writings of that time period and before that have been discovered and translated, it's special counsel. And you go, yeah, that compares to the White House special counsel, someone that has equal access to the king or to the president. They have a long-standing relationship with them, special relationship of trust, and they have a high security clearance. Now that's where you have this conflict set up. A-Haishar has obviously a high security clearance, and he's been admitted to even greater trust, that of being in the Select of 27. Zebud, who has a special relationship with King Solomon, also of trust, also with a high security clearance. Well, and you can tell that because he's gone to King Solomon's most retired apartment. That's where he's come to conduct important business with King Solomon. And it's late at night. It's after 9 at night, given our ritualistic symbolism. So Zebud is equally as important as the Grand Steward, as the Chief of Staff. But yet he's not in the Select of 27. He's not one of the builders in on the plans about the first 8 arches or the 9th arch. And it's interesting that that could occur, but it happens all the time in government, at the White House level and elsewhere. You can have someone that they're trusted with these secrets, and this person over here gets to have a different set of secrets. And it's been that way for centuries. And it's true in Masonry. There are people in Masonry that get to have, they're trusted with certain secrets, and others are trusted with another set of secrets. They're equally trusted, but there is a distinction being made by the king or the ruler or the grand master. And this happens quite often. And I'm probably amongst this group, all of us have experienced that, of being someone that is a keeper of secrets for the ruling elite of your Masonry, but yet you don't know everything. Someone else may have the rest of the story. And it's only if the two of you get together that the whole story is known. There is with Zebud also the fact that when he is given, well, first let's turn to how Solomon handles this. Here's Zebud. He's been discovered. The captain of the guard advises King Solomon who this is that is about to be put to death for violation, having come through this most sacred of entries into the ninth arch. That person had to have had some special access is quite clear, or they wouldn't have gotten that far. There's no question raised of how did he get in here, but yet King Solomon is, he's thinking, well, I'm going to have to have him put to death. There's nothing I can do. This is my special counsel. But he's not one of the selected 27. I made a choice, either on my own or with the other two ancient grand masters, Hiram, king of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff, that only a certain number of people would know these secrets. And Zebud wasn't amongst that group. He may have been my special counsel, my trusted person, but we three had not agreed that he would be included. So his fate is to be death for being where he shouldn't be. So they retire, though, and King Solomon does ask for the counsel of the other two ancient grand masters. And at that point, I'll give you a little sideline. Ancient grand masters of what? Are the three principles that we know of, King Solomon, or Solomon, king of Israel, as we so often refer to him, Hiram, king of Tyre, and Hiram Abiff, are they equal in authority and jurisdiction over like a grand lodge of the selected 27 or of the Masons within Solomon's kingdom? Or are they grand masters of their own respective jurisdictions or classes of Masons, but treated as equals by King Solomon and worthy advisors to him, so that Solomon would be the grand master over whatever goes on within Israel among the Israelites, the members of his kingdom. Hiram, king of Tyre, would be over his own kingdom as well as those that have traveled with him, fellow countrymen, fellow subjects. And then Hiram Abiff perhaps was grand master of a special class of Masons who are dedicated to the work on the temple. I just throw that out there for you to consider that. We refer to them as the three ancient grand masters, but yet we've never had a definition of what they're grand masters of. And if you can find that in the degrees, please let me know. That is, I think, worthy of discussion and consideration as we look at how Solomon solves his dilemma. He's faced with having to kill one of his most trusted advisors. And yet he has, on the other hand, as we will see, he has a grand steward who is probably a relative of his, a blood relation, who has a special trust with him by blood, probably by being loyal in the past, or his family, part of his family being loyal to King Solomon. And also by virtue of the fact that he's been made a special part of the selected 27. He holds a very important office within that. So when he turns to his advisors, and if you will, the senior warden, being that king, Hiram, king of Tyre, and the junior warden, if you will, in Hiram Abiff, they say, well, no, King Solomon, it looks like you're right about the law. That's it. But let's go back, tell him what the situation is, and see what he says. I'm paraphrasing there and being a little liberal, but in effect, they did go back. And when they do give a chance to Zebud to speak. So he presents in his defense what? That I didn't get here by disobedience or just mere curiosity, as you might think. I got here because you had told me a door would be left open, meaning that I would become a master mason. He didn't say that, but that's what apparently King Solomon meant at the appropriate time. But he finds the door open. He has important business to discuss with King Solomon. The door is open, it's ajar, whatever, and he goes right on in. Now, King Solomon is not likely, like most kings or rulers or grandmasters or other Masonic leaders, to say, oh, I've made a mistake. I should have made sure that door was sealed. Because you think about this. When King Solomon came from his most retired apartment through that entrance, special entrance into the ninth arch, either he or A-Haishar forgot to make sure the door was shut, didn't he? That door was left open. And very likely it's King Solomon himself who left it open, thinking, oh, A-Haishar will take care of it. So we have a situation where now fault comes back upon the leader. Oh, what to do? Well, most leaders, whether they're in government or business or Masonically, do what? Put the blame back on the guy that's bringing up the fact of their own error, and they push it away from themselves. They don't take responsibility, much like Adam in the Garden of Eden. Oh, it wasn't me, it was the woman. She did it. She persuaded me. I didn't do anything wrong. So we have it here with King Solomon. He's in a bad spot. And his two wise counsels, his co-equals in sharing authority, or at least in sharing that special responsibility of the selective 27, the sacred trust of Freemasonry. They go, well, you know what? We've got a solution. But it involves killing the Grand Steward and opening up his position. And whether that death is symbolic or otherwise, it's still a hard choice for Solomon. But it's one which he knows has to be done. And with the advice of the other two leaders, that's what he does. Just think if in government, in business, and in masonry, how many stupid decisions could be avoided if people in leadership positions, as grand masters, as worshipful masters, or whatever other office they hold, they seek the counsel of their brother Masons. In recent times, we've seen a lot of stupidity in Freemasonry and leadership decisions that have occurred. And it doesn't matter which one or which side you're on any of these stupid decisions, there still were stupid decisions. And they could have been avoided if people had just simply talked them through. And if people were there open to that kind of advice. And so it is, we have the Solomonic rule of three. King Solomon clearly was supreme within his own country, his own nation, his own empire. But yet, he readily accepted advice and counsel from others. And I think that's something that we can take from the whole situation. The importance of being Zebud is not just like Zebud to give counsel, but to be ready to receive counsel. All of Masonry would be far better off at this time if we ruled following the example of King Solomon. And thus, in that sense, we ruled in favor of Zebud for a just disposition. So we've got, in review, we have A-Haishar, who's of royal blood. We have Zebud, who may or may not be a royal blood, but most likely holds a position because of trust and service to the king, to the craft, if you will. But yet, though he had that service to the craft, he was not part of the inner circle, the selective 27, in this most important endeavor of building the temple. Because why? That temple was there to confer the Master Mason degree, if you'll recall. That was the purpose of the ninth arch. They weren't doing it in the lodge room above in the Holy of Holies. They were going to do it in the secret vault below. And I find that intriguing, that if in building our lodges that we haven't included a secret vault in all of them to follow that example. But symbolically, in that second section of the Master Mason degree, perhaps we are demonstrating that secret vault in terms of the various means of interment of our Grand Master Hiram Abiff. We then have Zebud in his role as special counsel now becomes select of 27. So does this mean he becomes the Grand Steward? Is this why so many councils have the name Zebud? In Missouri, we have Zebud number 25. I don't think our companions of the past put importance in the name Zebud just because his life was saved. Bible scholars have a great amount of research that they've churned, and you can find a lot of this on the internet. Zebud, in spite of only being mentioned very briefly in the Bible in 1 Kings 4, they attribute to him great powers of wisdom and counseling, and they say everybody should be like Zebud. Masonic writers, not so much. So now, please understand, I haven't been down at the Missouri Lodge of Research in the library at our Grand Lodge building, where I could pour through book after book the last couple of years because of COVID situations and renovations that are being made in our building down there. But I would challenge each of you not to, for the purpose of proving me incorrect, although you're welcome to do so, but find the writings about Zebud. You would think somewhere in the 1800s, there'd be something about him, about his qualities, his characteristics, and what has occurred, and perhaps even a discussion of what we're talking about today, about this choice that was made between the chief of staff and the special counsel. Thus far, I haven't found it, but the internet is unreliable, as we all know. But if you can find those kind of things, or if there's mention in Scottish Rite degrees that I haven't found yet about Zebud's qualities or his role, perhaps after this time, I would welcome it. I'll be a little bit embarrassed because I haven't found it yet, but I can live with it. I receive wise counsel from all sides, and I'm willing to accept it. And that is what I encourage all of you to be. I would also note that in terms of, here I'm telling you that Zebud was special counsel. One of the biblical scholars had come up with the idea that what his term particular friend meant was waiter, W-A-I-T-E-R. Yeah, he's just, he's there. He's thinking King Solomon maybe wants a glass of iced tea or a cup of coffee late at night, and that was the important business. Well, that's the way it is with some of these names in the Bible. But I think it's imperative upon us to recognize that our ancient companions and brethren have chosen these names, these characters to include because of the meaning of those names, and that we need to strive to learn about these names because they have a lot of symbolism for us. And so if we just say, well, he's the waiter, and old A-Haishar was just the butler, like Benson, we're doing a disservice to ourselves. You can see this in the Silver Trowel. Adonijah, who is the one that is going to presume to take the kingship with, shall we say, the popular will, the confidence of the people, rather than Solomon, who's viewed as weak. They're going to take it without checking with God or with King David. Well, Adonijah means my king is Jehovah. So for Adonijah not to seek counsel from God or from King David is a betrayal of his own namesake. And I think this is true of many of the characters we have represented in our degrees, and that our brothers before our time did think these things through. It's not mere accident. And it's incumbent upon us, as I've suggested, for us to look into these things. So with that, my friends, I recommend to us that all leadership in Freemasonry should follow the Solomonic rule of three. And when we have choices to be made about who shall lead, who shall continue in receiving more light in Freemasonry, we need to be very, very careful and very, very circumspect. Don't have anyone presume that they have a right to entitlements. They can be Lewis's. They can be people who had a grand history of Freemasonry in their family history. There may be another who has earned it by merit that should be given the opportunity, either equally as entitled, shall we say, favored for advancement, but make the choice based upon all the facts. Don't jump to conclusions. Don't think that someone is trying to offend you because they ask a certain question. Seek counsel and communicate amongst the brethren about all situations. In that world, I think there would be no Masonic charges and no Masonic trials. Might be fewer Masons, but that's another story. So with that, after the break, we'll take questions.